July 2025, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management sent out a memo announcing new workplace rules. The memo loosens rules that prevented employees from trying to talk to coworkers about religion, including proselytizing. It's a move that might seem like a win for religious liberty, but it might also look like a threat to the boundary between church and state.
Some political thinkers have been raising the alarm lately, warning that that boundary is in jeopardy. For instance, in a recent book titled America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State, scholar Randall Ballmer argues that the line between religion and government is eroding, and that this is dangerous.
For most of our history, we've taken the separation of church and state for granted in this country. It's a long-standing idea in our public discourse. But where did this idea actually come from? Is it in our Constitution, and why is it so important for American public life?
And as Catholics, what's our stance on it? What do Catholics believe about the separation of church and state? That's what we're exploring in this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi, Emily. How are you today?
I'm good. So I keep thinking about my husband works for a large biotech company, and he often will laugh when he walks by and we're in a meeting or something and I'm giving an opening prayer, or me and you are casually talking about, oh, what do you believe about the incarnation? He always says, oh, well, these kinds of conversations don't happen in my workplace. It's kind of funny. And I keep thinking about this rule that now it's okay to share your religion at work, which actually does apply for a lot of his friends who work at organizations like the CDC and the NIH, who are scientists, and who religion never had any place in their workplace. And now all of a sudden it's this kind of, if you believe the memo, it's kind of a free-for-all with everyone trying to convert everyone, including managers trying to convert employees, which, I mean, that seems like a whole misuse of power there, but that's a whole other issue, right? So yeah, it's just something I keep thinking about, this rule and kind of the implications of that.
Yeah, having worked in a lot of different religiously affiliated workplaces, I feel as though there's something kind of potentially just bringing an added level of drama to the situation.
Yeah, and it also, implicit in the rule, I think, is this sort of privileging of Christianity, possibly Judaism, right? The memo makes clear that this doesn't apply to things like atheism, because atheism is a philosophy, not a religion. And so you can't try to convert someone to a philosophy. So that already includes kind of an imbalance there.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, what if people are trying to convert their coworkers to religions that very specifically are not Christianity or Judaism or even Islam? What if I wanted to convert everyone to Zoroastrianism, which happens to be a really cool religion?
Right. And there just seems to open up so many sorts of questions. Yeah, there are a ton of Zoroastrians in the United States. Most of them are in Iran and India. But what about Islam, right? Islam is the third largest religious group in the United States. There are about 4 million Muslims in America. And so if a federal employee wanted to start not just sharing their Muslim faith in the workplace, but trying to get someone to go to a mosque with them, would that law protect them and their quote unquote proselytizing at work?
And that additionally makes me wonder, at what point does just a conversation about this is my religion cross that line into proselytizing? And as you mentioned, if it's a manager or someone in a position of power doing it, there's going to be some weight there that might not exist if it were just a conversation back and forth between employees on an equal footing. But then the elephant in the room here is that in the United States, a lot of people who are talking about religious liberty really just mean religious liberty for Christians alone.
And I also think it is, I don't know if interesting is the word, but there's the fact that all of this discussion over the power of Christians in the national government that is going on right now seem to directly counteract Jesus, who said in Scripture, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God.
And it even seems like some of our past church leaders may have missed the memo on that one. When you look at medieval history, some of the things we've discussed here on this podcast, we've had popes wielding power over emperors, Popes were leading armies. Popes amassed an awful lot of wealth. And of course, we can say, there's always this distinction between what the church is called to do and what the people in the church actually do.
But I also think that that's part of the reason why we were always taught that we now have a nation where there is a separation between church and state so that we don't return to those sorts of situations. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm glad you asked, is what Catholics believe about the separation of church and state. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now back to the question of the day. What do Catholics believe about the separation of church and state?
To help us answer this question, we talked to political philosopher and activist Stephen Schneck. Schneck is retired faculty at the Catholic University of America, where he had previously served as director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies.
Under President Obama, he served on the White House Advisory Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He is on the board for Catholic Climate Covenant, Sojourners, and Democrats for Life of America. He has published extensively on political philosophy and public policy.
Steve, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast again.
Emily, it's always a delight to be here, and it's good to see you as well. Oh, and hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Steve. The phrase separation of church and state has become something of a catchphrase in current discourse. But where did the idea originate? And what does it really mean?
So the idea has its origins in the horrible European religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th century. I think that we all know enough history to realize just how horrible those were. Its origin also lies to a certain extent in the philosophy that's called humanism of that same historical period, which celebrates the dignity and the freedom of individual conscience. So you could say that its provenance lies with people like Erasmus, John Locke, René Descartes, and so on. And this is the same origin, by the way, from which our current ideas of things like human rights and liberal democracy emerge. They all emerge out of this milieu of the 17th and 16th and 17th century.
What about what the Catholic Church says about the relationship between faith and government? Does Catholic social teaching or the church as a whole have any sort of official teaching on the relationship between church and state?
It does. The key document regarding the separation of church and state in the Catholic world is the church's teaching Dignitatis Humanae, which was written by Paul VI in 1965. That document, which is an apostolic exhortation, somewhat echoes the U.S. First Amendment in that it advocates for the free exercise of religion in society, and yet also insists that both individual faith and institutionalized religion should be free from coercion by government. Dignitatis has been endorsed and enlarged upon by JP2, by Benedict XVI, and by Pope Francis. So this is a pretty central teaching now in the Church's social magisterium.
So lately, it seems that the line between church and state is being blurred somewhat. For instance, we've seen the IRS largely stop enforcing the Johnson Amendment, which restricts ministers from endorsing candidates from the pulpit. Could you say a little bit about the purpose of that amendment, and is this really happening? And if so, what are the implications of these changes?
Well, the blurring is happening in a number of places, not just in regards to the Johnson Amendment. For example, we're seeing organized and strident calls from several quarters in our politics asking government to promote religion, particularly Christianity, and even for government to be an instrument of Christianity. And these calls range from fringe notions like Trump is God's messenger to more traditional efforts demanding that the Bible be taught in public schools and that the Ten Commandments be posted in public places and so forth. In response to kind of the general thing, and then I'll talk a bit more specifically about the Johnson administration, I would encourage Catholics to remember that we created our system of Catholic schools and hospitals back in the 19th century so we could practice our faith freely in a society that seemed to want to be imposing a version of Protestantism on us. So Catholics in the 19th century knew firsthand why separation of church and state was so important, and I'd encourage your listeners to revisit that history today. In regards to the Johnson Amendment specifically, and here I want to say I'm no expert on the IRS and tax laws as it relates to campaigns and so forth, but maybe I can make a couple of general remarks. The Johnson administration, the Johnson Amendment was actually named for Lyndon Johnson, by the way, was put in place back in the 50s, if I remember right, arguing that organizations like private schools, charities, and especially churches shouldn't be working for political campaigns. And if you just think about churches in that context, you can see why the Johnson Amendment works to help protect the separation of church and state. Just in this last year, with an executive order, President Trump instructed the IRS to no longer prosecute churches that engaged in political campaigning. And this would weaken the Johnson Amendment. I think that's a big mistake. First of all, it would open the door for certain religious groups to become even more influential in shaping government. And of course, then we have to ask what that means for those of us who don't belong to those certain political groups. But secondly, and this one is really where my heart is, I think it's a risk to religion. We've already seen Americans turning away from religion because they think that it's too political, particularly young people. And things like this would only make matters worse. I want my church, to be about the Gospels and the sacraments, not about political party platforms.
I also think it's worth saying for our listeners that the USCCB put out a statement, I think in June, that their policy still stands, right? Catholic churches should not be making any sort of political message about which candidates to endorse or oppose from the pulpit.
Yeah, Emily, I remember actually Archbishop Laurie in Baltimore had a strong statement to that effect. So, this is widely supported within the Catholic Church.
To your point about the weakening of the Johnson Amendment possibly giving certain religious groups more power that already are powerful, some critics have argued that Christian nationalism is starting to fill the space once held by the ideal of religious pluralism. Do you think that's an accurate thing to say, an accurate thought?
Yeah, I suppose it is. The promise of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was that Americans would be free to practice their faith, free to believe according to their personal discernment about matters of religion. So people of all faiths and from all over the world came to the United States as a land of religious freedom. Now, of course, given what I just said a few minutes ago, we know that promise was not always kept. Catholics, Mormons, Jews, and other religions and denominations have suffered horrible discrimination and sometimes even persecution. But the promise of religious freedom was always there. Christian nationalists essentially want to erase that promise. And frankly, not only is that not American, it's not Christian.
So just to kind of put myself in the shoes of someone who promotes Christian nationalism for a moment, um, what if they were to say, look, Christianity is the word of God. God has given us everything that we need to know to live um, virtuous lives and organize our communities according to the right ordering that God wants. So, wouldn't you want to have the nation run on Christian principles? I could even put a progressive twist on it and say, wouldn't I want the nation run on Christian principles because then we'd welcome the stranger and care for the poor? Shouldn't the church be in charge of everything? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, good question, Rebecca. My whole career in public life has been advocating for government to do the right thing as inspired by my Catholic faith. So naturally, I'm very much in favor of a role for faith in public life. But a couple of things. First, I think the role of faith should come from below. By that, I mean that each of us as citizens um, should, come to public life inspired by our faith, and from below, as citizens, try to move government in the direction of what our faith is calling us to do. And secondly, my understanding of the importance of human dignity and the primacy of free conscience means that we really must allow for and respect people who have beliefs that are different from mine. And they should be able to advocate for whatever their faith inspires them to do in public life as well. Religious nationalism doesn't come from below. It would have the state impose faith from above, and it would not allow for a diversity of religious beliefs, but it would instead, because it's all coming from the source of the state and imposed by the power of the state, it would be essentially steamrolling all the diversity of religion over and replacing it with a single denominational interpretation of what Christianity or whatever it is might be.
Last season of the podcast, we did a whole episode on Catholic integralism. How does this kind of play into all these ideas we're talking about? How does that kind of relate to the questions about the relationship between the church and the state?
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't hear the podcast on integralism. I'll go back and look for it. The easiest way to understand Catholic integralism is as a Catholic version of Christian nationalism, frankly. Catholic integralists believe that the state should not be secular and not neutral in regards to things like values, but instead it should be an instrument of the Roman Catholic Church and the Church's teachings. In our traditional American and democratic way of thinking about society and public life, we believe that the government should be guided by what citizens decide and limited by the rights of citizens. We live in a democracy where government is supposed to be a servant to the people. As the Constitution says, we the people are sovereign. Integralists believe instead that that kind of sovereignty should really belong to the Catholic Church, and that government should be guided and limited by the Catholic religion and its teachings. It's really pretty hard to square with anything that we've come to know as Catholics in the United States.
So, what would a healthy, ethical relationship between church and state look like based on the church's social teachings?
I think Pope Benedict actually has some insightful things to say about this. One of his encyclicals, Deus Caritas Est, speaks specifically to this. There he starts by talking about, I think it's Matthew's gospel, where Jesus distinguishes between what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God, separating church and state. But Pope Benedict takes this separation not to mean that there is no relationship between church and state, but rather that they are interrelated. Religion needs the state, Pope Benedict argues, to provide justice in light of the common good. Yet the state cannot do that without citizens who seek the common good. And the question is, where do we find such citizens? Well, Benedict argues, and I love this argument, that it's religion that provides the state with citizens who have that. So from this, Benedict concludes that the state ought never impose religion, and that religion ought never rule over the state. Yet they need each other. So the state needs to somehow create a space or an order in society in which religions can thrive, therefore guaranteeing religious freedom and a kind of harmony among the religions, so that the state gets the citizens that are necessary for the state to succeed in pursuing the common good.
stake for ordinary Catholics if the wall between church and state continues to erode? Is this simply a constitutional issue, which is problematic enough, or does it start to touch at something deeper about how we live out our faith in public life?
Yeah, it's really the latter, Emily. For all the reasons I've already mentioned, this is bigger than just another political or legal disagreement. Separation of church and state. I mean, it and its corresponding notion of religious freedom, by the way. These are essential elements of our rights in the way that we understand democracy to work in this country. So eroding that wall of separation risks very much. And I think, as I said before, I think Catholics should especially feel this in their bones. It wasn't that long ago when an earlier version of nativist nationalism in the United States was prejudiced against our Catholic beliefs as calling them un-American. And if maybe you and I haven't experienced such discrimination so much in our lives today, then we should ask our grandparents who do in fact remember that kind of discrimination. Let's not allow that sort of thing to happen again to us as Catholics or to any other religion in this country.
So, for Catholics who are aware of this and concerned, or aware of this and confused, what are some ways we can respond? What are some practical ways we can respond? And what are some resources we can go to for clarity?
Actually, the USCCB has a number of documents that are already just wonderful on these topics, and I would encourage everyone to go there. I think some of the, I think Dignitatis Humanae is certainly accessible, a readable apostolic exhortation that could be available to everybody. More difficult reading might be some of the encyclicals like Deus Caritas Est that I mentioned before. A little bit more challenging, or Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, would be another document that I'd recommend. But I'd also encourage, it's interesting to note that it's faith-based groups that are, for the most part, out there in public life on the ramparts, trying to defend the separation of church and state, trying to protect religious freedom. And I would encourage, Catholics to, look to support in what ways they can efforts by these faith-based groups, many of which are either Catholic or have, large Catholic contingents. Support these groups in their effort to protect both freedom of religion and separation of church and state, because these two are so closely intertwined.
We wanted to try to end on a somewhat hopeful note. And so I wanted to ask you if you see examples of faith communities engaging with politics in ways that are constructive and that strengthen democracy. Where is that happening around the country?
Yeah. Well, some of the faith-based groups that I just mentioned that are active in our national and local politics today on these issues are worth are, I think, very hopeful signs of the future. Protecting the wall of separation of church and state and protecting religious freedom, these things go hand in hand with protecting democracy from authoritarianism as well. And by protecting the rights of conscience, the rights of faith, the rights of belief, we're really protecting our deepest freedoms from the state's overreach. And if we lose those freedoms, then I think democracy itself is compromised, possibly even becoming meaningless. So I think we should find inspiration and hope in the work of faith-based groups that are out there in the trenches doing the hard work of trying to defend these fundamental rights.
So, we always close these conversations by asking, if people were to take just one thing away from our conversation, what would you want that to be?
What I'd like them to take from today's conversation is the recognition that the Catholic Church stands really strongly in favor of the separation of church and state and the corresponding idea of religious freedom. It's become a central tenet to the church's social magisterium, and I think that it's more important today than it has ever been. So that's what I'd like them to take from today's discussion.
Thanks, Steve. That's all our questions. And thank you again for coming here and talking to us and for such a a great and kind of worrying conversation, but an important one, I think.
Yeah, it's a tough topic. But well, it's good to see you both. It's great to do this. Anytime you want to do something similar, think about me. Happy to do
Oh,
it.
absolutely.
We will take you up on that.
All right. Good talking to you both. Good seeing you both as well.
Well, that was one of those podcast discussions where I felt like I could have kept on asking questions all day.
Yeah, I have worked with Steve for a long time, and I always appreciate how he manages to connect all these different ideas and lay them out so clearly and really make clear why they matter to real Catholics on the ground living out their faith.
So, yeah, was there anything in that conversation that surprised you?
Yeah, I don't know. We talk about separation of church and state as this distinctly American thing that grew up with the Constitution. And I really appreciated that Steve took a step back and rooted the idea in these philosophers like Locke and Descartes that were before America, that were certainly America was inspired by in our founding, but that it was part of this broader history that happened alongside these bigger conversations around human rights and democracy. And I think that that is important to realize that this wasn't just something that America came up with, that it is bigger and has more to do about human dignity and freedom of conscience that is really at the heart of our tradition.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because some of the current critiques or even attacks on our democratic republic are coming from people who are very critical of the concept of the United States at all. Like it was a liberal Enlightenment invention. We need to get rid of that and go back to the Middle Ages. And that actually leads into what it was that kind of surprised me, which was that the church has supported separation of church and state for a long time. Because I knew that these debates were happening. And I remember teaching Dante's Monarchia and being like, look, guys, here's Dante, the great medieval thinker, arguing for separation of church and state. Um, but I wasn't aware of what the church's actual approach was, possibly because so many church leaders were very clearly trespassing on Caesar's terrain, as it were.
Yeah, this is certainly a topic that people are talking about now, right? Like we've done so many podcast episodes and articles on Christian nationalism and Catholic integralism, and this is something that's on people's minds right now. And Steve had this line. He said something about how people think that by tying together, by giving the Catholic Church more power, that seems like a good thing for religion, right? If you're Catholic, why don't you want Catholic morals to run the country? But that actually people are leaving the church because it feels too political. And he said that, and when he was talking, I don't know if I dismissed it, but I think I was like, oh, that's just one of the things that older people say, and I don't know if it actually reflects younger people. We hear so much about like the conservative young people and this conservative revival of the Catholic Church. So I looked it up, and he's actually true. There are Pew studies and other studies that I don't have it in front of me right now, so don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like 16% of people have gone to a church and not returned because of the politics they heard from the pulpit. And that number goes way up if you're talking about younger people. And so I think that is also something that surprised me, that was a little bit different from how we currently talk about this, that young people are turning away from faith. People are turning away from faith because it feels too political. And that, I think, is a good reminder for anyone involved in ministry.
Yeah, I believe there's a very gendered component to that too, where a lot of young men may be joining, especially more traditional leaning churches, whereas a lot of young women are leaving for exactly the reasons that you just outlined.
Well, it also makes sense too, right? Like if the people who are staying in the church are more conservative, like the politics, and that's why we get the sense of the church as a more and more conservative thing, because people are feeling like they don't have a place. And I think it probably works backwards too. I don't want, for someone who's listening, I can also imagine a scenario where I don't know necessarily think I would want a pastor to proclaim about liberal political candidates from the pulpit, or to be a single issue kind of progressive preacher any more than I would want them to be preaching about abortion every Sunday or proclaiming about conservative candidates from the pulpit, right? I think it does go both ways.
Yeah, and that really opens up an interesting question, which is when people say, I left my church because it was getting too political, do they really mean it was getting too political, or do they mean it was getting political in a way I don't like?
It was getting too divisive.
Yeah. There's also, I want a religious leader to speak forcefully and prophetically on the political issues of our day that are also moral issues. Oh, there's a difference between that and, saying you have to vote for this candidate or using the power of the church to shame and guilt people. And I feel like that's a whole conversation I wish that more people were having, which is how to balance that call for the church to be political against the reality, everything that Steve outlined for us, which is that we need to maintain that separation. Our religious liberty depends on it.
Yeah, I think that's speaks a lot to what Steve was saying is like you can be political without engaging in politics. I think is that differentiation I'm looking for. Because you're right, I do want my church to be political. I do want it to speak to how we should act as citizens in the world in both large and small communities. But I don't want my church to be saying vote for this person or believe this about this specific issue. Yeah, so I think that kind of gets to the next question, which was things I wish that Steve had talked more about. And for me, that moment was I think you asked him about examples of where this was happening. And he was like, there's a lot. Read these documents, which was great. But I did want to kind of end on this more hopeful note of like, here is this group, this specific group that is doing something to really preserve the church state relationship. I would love to see examples that are happening either at the parish or the diocesan level in schools, in advocacy groups, in preaching that really show what appropriate political engagement looks like.
Yeah. And I know, I mean, we work, because of the nature of our work, we encounter writers and journalists and activists who are doing work like this, but it would be very cool to have kind of a database of religious groups who are working to preserve the separation of church and state as a religious liberty issue and out of respect for the dignity of the human person fundamentally. Something I wanted more information about is I always get sidetracked by the history of it, and I would love to see a thread of how this idea developed when you consider how often, as aforementioned, church leaders were not respecting any kind of a boundary between these two things.
Yeah, along those same lines, I was also wondering what this looks like in other countries. America and church and state relationship is its own thing, but what does this look like? What does this church teaching look like in other contexts where there is a large proportion of Catholics?
Yeah, I keep thinking about France, which is like super secular, partially, I think, in a reaction to the religious wars and the history. I don't know, because people always talk about secular France, and it seems like there's a difference between being secular on a official political level and being secular in that, oh, no one does religion and no one goes to church. I'd be interested in seeing how those things balance out. And then also, of course, with other religions, I'm curious about how other religions do or don't manage to strike that balance.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I've been having with my husband lately about countries that have a large amount of Muslims and that we in America, especially after 9/11, were taught to fear Islamic countries, right? Like there was all of this rhetoric. And it's not countries that have Muslims in it, it's Islamic governments. And those are two very different things. And I think you could say something very similar about Christian governments, that it's not having Christian citizens who are super involved in politics that's an issue, because, as Steve said, our belief in Christ calls us to be engaged in politics, to calls us to build the kingdom of God. It is when the government becomes Christian that then it opens itself up to just as many possibilities of abuse of power as a fundamentalist Islamic government.
Yeah, this is something I discuss with my family a lot also, how it seems as though the fundamentalist variation on every major religion seems to trend towards trying to take control. And then all of a sudden, all of the worst aspects in that religion's history start coming to the fore. And you have this tremendous distinction between what the religion claims to be and then what the religion is actually doing. So it really does seem like for a religious group to take power and take over a government ends up kind of betraying the core and the essence of what that religion is actually committed to when it comes to the good and peace and service.
Well, I think that kind of gets into our last question, which is if you were to preach a sermon on this topic, what would the takeaway be?
I think if I were going to preach a sermon on this topic, I would remind people that God created us with free will. And throughout the history of Christianity, the idea has always been that if we choose to turn to God, it has to be a choice that comes from the heart. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And there are certainly cases in which it's legitimate to coerce certain actions. So, we can coerce a person not to murder, for instance, but to coerce faith is a fundamental contradiction. So, as Christians, we should not be trying to force people to assent to our faith because it won't work. It's not assent.
So, building off of what you said, Rebecca, I think I would talk about what Steve said about Pope Benedict and what he believed about the role of faith in politics and in common life, and talk about how our role as Catholics, our belief isn't that we should impose faith from above, because that, like you said, weakens both our faith and our state, but it is to live it out authentically from below as citizens who are shaped by these beliefs, who bring specific values into public life. And that is how we strengthen both our church and democracy.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Do you have an example of a group that is doing the work of preserving the separation between church and state? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org.
Before we wrap up, we're excited to share a new ministry for immigrants and anyone impacted by forced migration. This ministry is led by our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries. Somos, Together We Are Faith, Hope, and Strength, is a social media campaign offering spiritual care and resources for immigrants on their journey. Find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Help us spread the word and support the migrant community. To learn more, visit claretians.org.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Santa, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.